Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all of you joining us online today. This is Sarah Dalrymple speaking, Senior Policy Advisor at Development Initiatives. I'm delighted to welcome you to the first in a series of webinars being hosted by Development Initiatives in 2019. This series aims to build coherence between crisis, development and peace actors, with a particular focus on financing in protracted crisis contexts, where the responses of these different actors are more likely to overlap in practice, and to identify ways in which international policy commitments on this issue, such as those agreed at the World Humanitarian Summit and the more recent DAC recommendation on the Nexus, can be transformed into reality. Throughout this webinar series, some key overarching questions will guide discussions, which have been drawn from our own analysis and the feedback that we have received. Firstly, how can development actors adapt financing approaches to address the unique challenges faced in fragile and crisis contexts? Secondly, what changes are needed in the financing landscape to deliver against the emerging rhetoric on development where possible and humanitarian only when necessary, and foster longer-term approaches which address the drivers of fragility and support sustained livelihoods? And thirdly, what is the impact of global financing mechanisms working at the interface between crisis and development that have emerged over recent years? Do they have the potential to be transformative and scaled up? And if not, what needs to change? This first webinar seeks to provide actors working in fragile and crisis situations with an overview of emerging development financing trends, with the opportunity to hear from development and crisis experts and explore possibilities for a more joined-up approach. We will be joined later in the session by a prominent set of panelists with expertise across development and crisis financing agendas. And we are lucky to be joined by David Donoghue, who will facilitate today's discussions, drawing upon his expertise across all aspects of the Nexus. David was Ireland's permanent representative to the UN until 2017 and co-facilitator of global negotiations culminating in the 2030 Agenda and the New York Declaration for Refugees and Migrants. David was also closely involved in Northern Ireland's peace process and is currently acting as a Distinguished Fellow at the Overseas Development Institute and Chair of Conciliation Resources. David, I will now hand over to you.
Thanks very much, Sarah, and welcome to all participants. I'm delighted to have been asked to co-facilitate the first of this series of webinars which Development Initiatives is organising. The theme for today, as you'll be aware, is what emerging trends in development finance mean for crisis actors. It's been a big theme in recent years that we need much greater coherence in the responses of humanitarian, development and peace actors in crisis situations. Obviously, if crises are protracted, and an increasing number of them are, these issues become particularly important and the need for coherence becomes even more acute. We need longer term development approaches, and I have to say that when I co-facilitated the negotiations which led to the New York Declaration on Refugees and Migrants, this was a very strong theme at that point, because you have a small number of host countries who are hosting large numbers of displaced people who in many cases have been in their countries for 15 or 17 years, and the insufficiency of short-term humanitarian approaches in the old-fashioned sense, the insufficiency of those approaches to deal with the wider developmental needs of long-term protracted crises was all too obvious. So I think it's a very good, very important and topical subject, and I look forward very much to today's webinar. We've had, of course, some key policy commitments made in recent years by the international community. Sarah has touched on them. There was the World Humanitarian Summit in 2016, and the new way of working to achieve collective outcomes. We had the Grand Bargain commitments. We had also the Addis Ababa Action Agenda in 2015. And in the 2030 Agenda, we had the pledge to leave no one behind and to endeavour to reach the furthest behind first. And as illustrations of the groups we were talking about there, we mentioned a number of the most vulnerable categories, such as migrants, refugees, and indeed IDPs. Recently, we've had the new DAC recommendation on the humanitarian peace and development nexus. The financing of the SDGs is, of course, an issue which comes up for discussion at the spring meetings of the IMF and the World Bank, also at the Financing for Development Forum, at the ECOSOC humanitarian segment in June, and there will be a special summit on, or high-level meeting on financing for development in New York in September. So basically, we all subscribe to the commitments we've made on coherence, but how can we achieve this in practice? That really is the centerpiece for today's webinar and indeed for the ongoing series. How can we get beyond the traditional humanitarian and development silos and achieve joined up working? Crisis financing is obviously a key area where we need to address this. There are questions really about how to achieve a complementary effort between development actors and crisis actors. There are, of course, stresses in both directions. You can have development actors who may feel threatened by increased pressures to devote resources to crisis situations. And conversely, there's some evidence of humanitarian unease, if I can put it like that, about the implications of the SDGs. So it is quite timely to try to look at how we can achieve better returns from the available resources and potential new resources. In particular, there are proposals for mechanisms which would seek to bridge the divide between humanitarian and development. The World Bank and WFP and FAO and other major multilateral actors are doing good work around coherence of effort, but we need to broaden out this debate and to involve the full range of actors. And that, as I say, is part of the background to today's discussion. I think, all have an interest in promoting the sharing of information, better sharing of information among various actors working. So to continue, we have assembled a range of development and crisis financial experts to look at how we can enhance information sharing among the various actors. What are the opportunities for joint working? Where can this work best? What should coherence or collective outcomes mean in practice? And how can we overcome the problems of poor information sharing, of a sort of a somewhat lazy tendency to continue with silo-based approaches? So a full agenda of issues to get into, and I look forward very much to the discussion. On some housekeeping points, I would ask participants to send in questions for our panelists using the question boxes as their presentations take place, and we will pass these on to panelists later in the session. We would also invite participants to contribute their own views through the chat box, and there will be questions there to stimulate thought as we go along. So I come now to the first of our presentations from Development Initiatives itself, and the aim now is to provide an overview of development financing stakeholders, the policy landscape, financing mechanisms, and emerging trends in development finance in protracted crisis contexts. First of all, we have Rob Tew, who is the head of research at Development Initiatives, and we also have Cecilia Kiao, who is a senior analyst at Development Initiatives and who is leading the organization's analysis of development finance. Rob Tew, has been head of research and analysis here and plays a lead role in developing development initiatives methodologies for the analysis of aid data, including the age bundle analysis featured in the Investments to End Poverty report. Cecilia Kiao leads the organization's research under that Investments to End Poverty program, which brings together DI's work on poverty and resources. The particular area of focus for Cecilia is the role of development cooperation in private sector development, including blended finance. So I turn first to Rob. Oh, Cecilia, you will take the floor first. Okay, Cecilia, over to you.
Thank you, David. And hi, everyone. This is Cecilia. So for those of you who are not familiar with the development financing landscape, I'll take you through the key policy processes and stakeholders, skimming the surface of the background document that was shared ahead of the webinar. You can find a link to this in the email that you should have received about an hour ago as well. So please do refer to that for more detail. And for those of you who are familiar with all this, please bear with us as we'll be moving quickly on to the findings from our analysis. So there are three overarching frameworks around which development financing policies are organized. On the slide, you can also see some of the follow-up processes that are related to these. The first one is the goal framework, which provides overall guidance related to what all actors involved in development finance are seeking to achieve. This is the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, which David has already mentioned, which was agreed in September 2015 and highlights the role and responsibility of all actors, public and private, domestic and international, to deliver on the 17 Sustainable Development Goals and the underlying principle of leaving no one behind. The second framework is the financing framework, which sets out the means to achieve the collective goals set out in the 2030 Agenda. The Addis Ababa Action Agenda is the guiding document for this. It was agreed in July 2015 at the 3rd International Conference on Financing for Development, and it highlights the role of different sources of finance, as well as the more systemic issues that need to be addressed. The third framework is the effectiveness framework, and this relates to how all actors can best work together to deliver on collective goals. It was established in 2011 when the Global Partnership for Effective Development Cooperation was set up to boost the international community's efforts towards development. The work of the GPDC includes, among other things, monitoring progress against 4 key effectiveness principles and also adapting them to new forms of development cooperation, such as private sector engagement. Lastly, we have the Stockholm Declaration. This renews the commitment of the international community to the New Deal for Engagement in Fragile States, which represents an action plan and guide for how to prioritize investment in peace building and state building in fragile contexts. The Stockholm Declaration outlines what signatories must do to revive the commitment to leave no one behind and achieve the SDGs, particularly in fragile and conflict-affected settings. Key stakeholders. So the key stakeholders in development financing can be grouped into 3 broad categories: providers of assistance, implementers, and finally influencers or providers of evidence and policy advice. Stakeholders are not always easily assigned to these categories, particularly as there are overlaps between the 3. So for illustration purposes, the slide lists actors by narrower categories on the left and provides examples of each on the right. So providers of development assistance can include bilateral donors, foundations, DFIs, multilateral institutions. These actors can also act as implementers alongside others, such as governments in partner countries and NGOs. Influencers and or providers of evidence include think tanks and your platforms and networks. And then in addition, there are standard setting institutions such as the UN and the OECD. And recently, the private sector has been playing a more substantial role in development financing, acting across categories of providers and implementers. Now onto the findings from our analysis. So we focused on a group of countries in protracted crisis, which we've termed protracted crisis countries, or PCCs for short. These are countries which have had at least 5 consecutive years of humanitarian response plans at any point between 2000 and 2017, with 2017 being the latest year for which we have country-level development finance data. We're focusing on protracted crisis in particular, as it's in these contexts that humanitarian development and peace actors are most likely to interconnect in practice. There are 27 protracted crisis countries, some of which have not been the subject of humanitarian response plans for a number of years, and others which have had humanitarian response plans for almost every year since 2000. Of these 27, 14 of them, the ones that you can see highlighted in the slightly lighter shade of green on the map, were still the subject of a humanitarian response plan in 2017. Our analysis excludes countries that have become protracted crisis countries since 2017. So what financing flows matter in protracted crisis countries? The slide shows the mix of resources in these contexts, as you can see in the donut there, and compares it with the mix of resources in other developing countries. A stark difference can be seen with protracted crisis countries relying on aid much more than other developing countries. On the left, a third of the section of the donut showing ODA is humanitarian assistance, and the other 2/3 of it are non-humanitarian assistance, non-humanitarian development assistance. Other developing countries on the right have much more access to resources beyond aid. And this difference can be explained, at least in part, by weaker domestic capacity and weaker private sector enabling environments in protracted crisis contexts. However, it's interesting to note that notwithstanding this, there's still a range of resources that flow into protracted crisis countries, spanning across public, commercial, and private sources. So, for example, remittances account for 1/5 of inflows and FDI for 14%. I'll now hand over to Rob to talk through the top line ODA trends.
Thank you, Cecilia. Yes, so we're now going to look more closely at the use of official development assistance, or ODA, in these contexts. Our research shows that ODA from DAC donors and multilateral bodies is not necessarily as focused as it should be on the poorest people. Now, as you can see from this chart, the countries that are home to 75% of the world's poorest people receive just 35% of ODA, which is targeted at specific countries. 40% of aid goes to countries housing 24% of people living in absolute poverty, and fully 1/4 of ODA goes to countries which are collectively home to just 1% of the world's poorest people. Now, this is important to the current discussion because a growing proportion of the world's poor is projected to reside in protracted crisis and fragile contexts by 2030. So development actors will be under increased pressure to target and to engage in these contexts. So this raises questions about the ways in which development aid is planned, delivered, and what might need to change in order to meet the unique challenges faced in these contexts. So when aid is dispersed by donor countries or multilateral bodies, it flows through a variety of agencies responsible for the implementation of aid-funded projects. And this chart illustrates the flow of developmental ODA, that is, excluding humanitarian aid. And much of this aid goes via government ministries or other public sector bodies within developing countries, and smaller but still substantial amounts are dispersed via non-governmental organizations or CSOs, and then multilateral bodies, as well as funding development projects from their own core funding, will also act as implementation partners on a number of projects. The flow on this chart that is marked as other, that represents development aid implemented through private sector firms, maybe teaching institutions, think tanks, and so on. Now, there's a notable difference between protracted crisis countries and other developing countries when it comes to the amount of development aid that's channeled through different types of implementing agents. In the non-crisis affected countries, fully 70% is channeled through governments. However, in protracted crisis countries, this is much lower. Less than half of developmental ODA is channeled via government agencies, and This largely reflects the greater challenge of working with and through governments in crisis contexts, as in these contexts, government capacity is often lower. Also, as you'll be able to see on this chart, multilateral bodies handle a much greater proportion of developmental aid in protracted crisis countries than in other countries. And also the proportion of developmental aid going via NGOs is substantially higher in protracted crisis countries.
So now let us look at what happens to the overall level of aid, both developmental and humanitarian, in the first 5 years of crisis. For the 27 countries we identified, developmental aid fell sharply between the first and fourth years of crisis, before recovering slightly while remaining at a lower level. Although humanitarian assistance did rise throughout the first 5 years of crisis, the rise was not enough to replace the fall in developmental aid. So by year 4, developmental aid was almost 5 billion lower than year 1, but humanitarian assistance had increased by just 2.6 billion. At the end of year 5, developmental aid had recovered slightly, but was still almost 4 billion below the year 1 level, while humanitarian aid rose to 2.9 billion higher than in year 1. So this raises questions about the ways in which development finance complements humanitarian assistance in a protracted crisis context. ODA should be able to be counter-cyclical, increasing to counter the impact of crisis. But is this always the case? Here we can see that the overall level of assistance is decreasing in the face of crises. To ensure that people's livelihoods and their access to basic services is sustained, should development assistance adapt and continue where possible throughout a crisis? Could this even prevent some crises from being protracted? Obviously, much depends on the specific context, but it is food for thought.
It's also interesting to look at what can happen when a country exits a crisis situation. For 12 of the 27 countries, we have data on aid levels for at least 3 years after their last humanitarian response plan. For these countries, in the first 3 post-crisis years, the situation shown in the previous chart was completely reversed. Although humanitarian aid fell as soon as the crisis had passed, the rise in development aid was substantially larger than the fall in humanitarian aid, meaning that the overall levels of ODA were now higher than they were during the crisis. And finally, let's turn to the issue of loans. Now, concessional loans have long been a part of the aid finance landscape for decades, both bilateral loans from DAC donors to developing countries, and also loans from the World Bank and regional development banks. Since 2007, there's been a marked increase in the use of loans as a form of aid. Loans made up around 14% of total ODA in 2007, but this had almost doubled to 26% by 2017. What's interesting to note is that donor and especially multilateral lending to crisis-affected countries has increased much more rapidly than lending to non-crisis countries. This chart shows on the lower line that loans to non-crisis countries did indeed double between 2007 to 2017, roughly. But loans to countries in crisis rose by 875% over the same period. This rise is from a low base, however, as prior to 2007, there was very little in the way of ODA loans being advanced to crisis-affected countries. And also here, it's important to note that we're not suggesting that loans are necessarily an inappropriate form of financing in protracted crisis countries, but this does raise questions for discussion. In particular, are the right financing mechanisms being used in the right places? And to answer this, there would be a need for stronger evidence on how these loans are being used, targeted, and the impacts on vulnerable and crisis-affected people. Looking at the countries that receive these loans, in 2017, 12 of the 14 countries that were still in protracted crisis received at least some of their aid in the form of loans, with some of these countries taking on new debt totaling hundreds of millions of dollars. Indeed, around 2/3 of developmental ODA, so not including humanitarian assistance, to Yemen and Mauritania was in the form of loans. It should be noted that Mauritania was listed as a country at risk of debt distress in a recent IMF assessment. And in fact, protracted crisis countries at risk of debt distress, or in the case of South Sudan, actually in debt distress, received over $700 million of new loans in 2017. The majority of this new lending is principally coming from the World Bank, which is not surprising given that the bank is the largest single source of concessional loans to developing countries worldwide. And 1.4 billion of new loans in 2017 came to protracted crisis countries came from IDA, the concessional lending arm of the World Bank. This represented about 12% of loans advanced by IDA in that year. And smaller but still substantial amounts of loans to protracted crisis countries came from concessional trust funds of the IMF and a number of regional development banks. And among DAC members, the great majority of loans to protracted crisis countries came from Japan and France. That concludes this presentation on the data, and we hope this has provided a useful foundation for further presentations and discussions. If you do have any questions on the data in this presentation, please email DI and we'll respond to you individually. Thank you very much. I'll hand back to you.
Thanks very much, Rob and Cecilia, for those very helpful analyses of first the frameworks which govern financial flows to crisis situations, and secondly then the particular the somewhat mixed picture surrounding ODA and the interesting reflections on the loans aspect. Thanks to both of you very, very much for that. So building on this presentation, we're now going to hear from four panelists as development and crisis financing experts who will provide an overview of the current finance landscape in protracted crisis contexts, dealing also with key challenges faced and opportunities for working more coherently with crisis actors in those contexts. So we turn first of all to Matthew Wyatt from DFID, who will address these wider questions. Matthew is the head of the Department of the Conflict, Humanitarian and Security Department in DFID. He's had more than 30 years of experience working on development issues at DFID and the European Commission and at the UN. And among his various assignments over the years has been that of UK ambassador to the UN agencies in Rome and also head of DFID in East Africa. Matthew, you have the floor.
Well, thank you very much, David, and thanks to Rob and Cecilia for a really fascinating presentation. I guess if we have the next slide, sort of starting from the top, DFID's goal, like I think many of the institutions here, is to try to help people live a life of dignity in which they can prepare for their families, send their children to school, and in which they're safe. And all that in the context, of course, of the global goals, which have already been mentioned and which we are fully committed to helping to realize. But I think if we go for the next slide, and as has already been mentioned, you know, we estimate in DFID that by 2030, 80% of the world's extreme poor are likely to live in fragile and conflict-affected states. And we know that already 9 of the world's 10 biggest humanitarian emergencies are in very fragile countries. So I think for both the development and humanitarian worlds, we have to recognize that our clients are basically those in conflict-affected and fragile countries, but we don't always act as if that's the case. So what's DFID trying to do about this? Well, for some time, we've had a commitment that we will spend at least half of our aid in fragile states. We are meeting that, which is great as far as it goes. But the question we're asking ourselves now is all that spending actually targeted towards making those countries more stable and building peace? Or are we simply cookie cuttering traditional development programs and shoehorning them into fragile states? So the question for us is, you know, are we actually doing good? Well, first of all, are we making sure and do we know that we're not doing any harm with the assistance that we're providing? But secondly, are we doing as much good as we can in terms of building peace? Our policy on this is set out. There's a couple of documents mentioned in the slide, our humanitarian reform policy and the building stability framework. And they're both statements of our policy on this, but they're also practical guides for our staff. So I do hope that people might get a chance to have a read of those and click on the links, or they're on our website if you're interested in that. So moving to the next slide, I think one thing that I think it is important to say from the outset is that with DFID, our country budgets are, most of them are managed by our country offices, and our country offices are empowered to flex as they see fit between humanitarian development and peace building instruments so that they can strike the right balance. So in country, we don't start ex ante saying we're going to put this much in humanitarian, this much peace building and so on. It's a decision for our country office heads. So that is one way in which we try to ensure that we have a coherent approach across those three things and develop a whole of portfolio approach. So for example, in countries such as Burma, Nigeria, and Somalia, we've got, alongside investments to address urgent humanitarian needs, which of course we ensure fully respect international humanitarian law and principles, we've also got initiatives to try and build more effective and legitimate institutions, more accountable health and education services, more inclusive economic development, and support mediation between conflict actors. So that's just to give a sense of the sort of the whole of portfolio approach. And then if we move to the next slide, I think we also, in DFID, we really believe that supporting resilience to shocks and preparedness are both extremely important, and also they offer absolutely fantastic returns and great value for money. So, for example, in our bilateral programs, we're doing work to build resilience of health systems to detect and respond to nutrition emergencies in countries such as DRC, Somalia, and Ethiopia. And we're also supporting a wide range of conflict resolution and peace building programs as well. And then at the global level, we've helped to establish the Global Risk Financing Facility, the GRIF, with our colleagues in Germany to help strengthen national disaster response systems. And with a close partnership with the World Bank, we've set up the London Centre for Disaster Protection to advise governments on how to leverage financing, including insurance financing, for disaster risk reduction and to try to enable earlier trigger-based responses. And I think we feel, coming back to the previous presentation, that trigger-based responses, ones that can happen before crises hit, that might go some way to avoid this sort of dip in the overall assistance when crises do hit and humanitarian aid doesn't meet the shortfall of development aid. So moving I think I'd like to suggest there might be four things that we should try to do together, or try to do better together. The first of those is really ensuring that there is sufficient funding for prevention and for resilience. At the moment, I think they're underfunded, and there's plenty we can do, even with the existing instruments we've got available to us, to do more in that space, provided that we provide the resources. The second thing I'd like to suggest is that we should use, well, develop and use innovative financing mechanisms that can really incentivize investments in prevention, resilience, and preparedness, building, for example, on the experience of the Peace Building Fund. And I should mention that DFID has doubled our contribution to the UN Peace Building Fund, partly because it helps fill that gap. Then, thirdly, I think we need to make sure that we try and use development financing wherever we can, but also that we design humanitarian responses when they are really needed that lend themselves to transitioning to longer term programming. And I think there's tremendous opportunities offered by cash interventions there, because you can have cash interventions on the humanitarian side, which then can transition, as governments get stronger and able to do so, into cash interventions for broader social protection, longer term social protection work and so on. And then fourthly, not to forget the important grand bargain commitment of flexible multi-year financing, something that I'm quite proud that DFID does quite well. So then moving to the next slide, the penultimate slide, I think that different financing approaches are really only the beginning. financing can drive more effective responses, but it needs to be underpinned by, to coin a phrase, perhaps a hackneyed phrase, but by new ways of working. And there are three ways we in DFID are trying to work a bit better and a bit smarter. The first of those is ensuring that our work is underpinned by conflict sensitivity analysis and grounded in good contextual and political understanding. So we need the right tools, but we also need the right people to be able to do that. And I think across the development world, we need to ask ourselves whether we've got both of those two things. The second area is really to make sure that we're identifying across humanitarian and development interventions that we're getting win-wins from our programs so that they're delivering their humanitarian or the development objectives, but they're also making a positive contribution to peace and resilience. And we've got to ask ourselves, if our health, education and livelihood programs aren't also actively designed to build stability and peace, then how can we possibly claim that they're sustainable or that they're even worthwhile? And then the third area that we're also putting a lot of effort into is that we feel that we need to do much more to gather and apply and share the best evidence of what works, because this stuff really isn't easy. So I realize I'm running out of time, so I'll be short on the final slide, but I think that where there are clearly challenges ahead of us as we seek to shift incentives that are currently skewed towards ex post responses and do more on ex ante responses, and as we try and develop new risk management approaches that are adapted to the context we're working in, there are big challenges there. But there is also a lot of good things happening. And you referred, David, in your initial remarks to a number of the kind of international initiatives that I won't repeat here, that I think are focusing more and more attention on these areas. And perhaps if I just leave with sort of three thoughts on takeaways that we might try and take from the discussion. The first is that our development, peace building and humanitarian financing has to all be making a positive contribution to building and a deliberate contribution to building resilience and stability, or we can't really claim that it's working. Secondly, we've got to get the financing and the incentives right to support resilience, prevention and stability. That's going to be absolutely essential. And thirdly, we need both the right, not just the right financing tools, but the right analytical tools and the right people, so we can avoid doing harm and ensure that we're doing everything we can to build peace and stability, which then reduces the risks of crises and the severity of those crises when they do occur. Thank you very much.
So I'll move on now to Dr. Olusoji Adeyi, who's the Director for Global Practice, Health, Nutrition, Population at the World Bank Group. Olusoji has had a very distinguished career in the health field in particular. He was the founding director of the Affordable Medicines Facility at the Global Fund. He's led many initiatives on global, regional and country health policies and programs. And I give you the floor, Olusoji.
Good morning. I want to thank David and Rob and Cecilia for. I will just share an overview with some specific examples of the unfolding work that the World Bank Group is supporting in context of fragility, conflict, and violence. You will find that specific examples that I will share with you. They are in the area of human development, i.e. health, nutrition, population, education, and social protection. That is the group within which I work. But I will share the big picture first. So where the work of the World Bank has been an evolutionary one, noting, of course, that World Bank support for post-conflict development, post-conflict reconstruction, development date back to its very founding when it was set up and tasked with to support the reconstruction of Europe following World War II. And then, of course, there was the launch of IDA. I'll say quite a bit about IDA. subsequently, either being the International Development Association or the concessional lending arm of the World Bank. But it hasn't all been about money per se. It's been a lot about about learning to inform our understanding of appropriate policies in different contexts, and therefore sharpen our approach over the years. So a bunch of research pieces, such as working papers, and of course there was the flagship report with the United Nations, Pathways for Peace, 2018, and our own World Development Report, which is the World Bank's annual flagship product, this time in Conflict, Security and Development some 8 years ago. We've also gone through different classifications of fragile states, which has now led to the harmonized list of such countries. And very significantly, under IDA 18, there's a lot of attention to continuing and expanding our policy engagement on multiple fronts. What has changed under IDA 18? Changes to the resource allocation framework, such that there's an increase in the support from IDA to fragile states from 7.2 billion in IDA 17 cycle, which is a 3-year cycle, basically doubled to some 14.4 billion. And also looking at a more customized or differentiated approach to suit different contexts and challenges, such as those then let me move on swiftly, because I would like us to have much time for discussion. When we go from the bigger picture that I've just summarized up front to how we seek to translate those policy commitments, those principles into practice in terms of country engagement and partner engagement, we're focusing or doing more in terms of first post-crisis crisis response. We're moving much more into preventive aspects. And of course, what we do is cross-cutting. We're engaging more at the interface between the humanitarian and development and peace dimensions, with additional emphasis on social cohesion. And we're very attentive to resilience and how we leverage partnerships across the spectrum, all with the intention of protecting what we call human capital that already exists in those countries, which, as you know, is among the first to suffer when conflicts or crises intensify. So in that context, what's our current engagement in the human development domain in countries afflicted by fragility, conflict, and or violence? Currently, the World Bank in various forms supports some 99 active projects in 36 of such countries. And we've got about 38 underway at various stages of preparation. And as I pointed out before, it's not all about money per se, it's also about learning and adaptation and informing policy dialogue. And we have close to 70 different kinds of learning activities underway and or technical assistance. Now, we also know that the gender dimension is very important, and is very sensitive to conflict, fragility, and violence for multiple reasons. Inequalities in opportunity, inequalities in protection of people during crisis, and also instances of frank gender discrimination or even violence in such situations. So we are sensitive to this in the kind of assistance that we provide, and I'll just cite 3 examples. I'll give top-line examples only. I will not go into the details because they're already on the PowerPoint. But one is the DRC Health System Strengthening Project. The second one is the Lebanon Health Resilience Project. And the third one is the Yemen emergency crisis response. If I may just note here, because in an earlier, I believe it was Rob and Cecilia, referring correctly to the terms of financing. For the operation in excuse me, for the operation in Yemen, for example, this is the Yemen Emergency Health and Nutrition Project, the project document of 2017. The $200 million there was actually an additional grant. That was not a repayable loan or credit in any shape or form. And also, as part of our work with partners, those, and given the reality in Yemen, that actually went through the United Nations Children's Fund, that's UNICEF, and WHO. So it's one of the ways in which, in very dire circumstances, we work through partner agencies to support country efforts when there is when there's active conflict going on. Moving to another continent, in the Democratic Republic of Congo, DRC, the most recent additional financing that was provided for health system strengthening for better maternal and child health services was actually an additional grant of some $120 million. So it's not all grant, but the point is, based on the terms that have been approved by our board of directors, sometimes it's credit, sometimes it's grant. And the way the bank determines that is beyond the specific scope of my presentation here. It's all in the public domain in any case. Just moving on onto the next slide there. We also recognize that to maximize effectiveness in practice, you need to work across sectors. So I've provided a few examples there of how we collaborate across sectors between health, for example, and our colleagues working in water and sanitation in Yemen, or our colleagues working on gender and education in Nepal, and of course, education and governance in terms of education service delivery for all in Nigeria. Finally, in terms of just my very brief introductory remarks here, I want to talk about coherence among development and crisis actors, because this is an area of central importance to our joint understanding of what is going on at the country level and the sub-regional level, and of course our joint effectiveness as we engage with countries and as we we finance and support the implementation of programs there. We place a lot of emphasis on having a shared understanding of the FCB dynamics, the dynamics in those countries. We also try to stick to our own comparative advantages, because it's very unlikely that a single institution can have very strong comparative advantage across every domain of this. So we do partner with and we work through other agencies. We'll also put a premium on enabling and supporting country-led programs. We're very big on joint learning and co-convening. And we do put a premium on transparency in terms of resource mobilization, the commitments, and the disbursements. So let me pause here, and I look forward to a very robust discussion. And once again, thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
Thank you very much, Obasoji, for that. It was very, very helpful. I turn to Leah Zamore. Leah, are you with us? Can you hear us?
Hi, David. Yes, I can.
Oh, great. Nice to hear you, hear your voice again, Leah. So for participants, Leah heads the Humanitarian Crisis Program at the New York University's Center on International Cooperation. She also co-directs an experts initiative on global refugee policy, and she is the co-author of a forthcoming book on the evolution of the international refugee protection regime. She has many other distinctions and has worked a lot on international human rights and humanitarian work. Leah, over to you, if I may.
Great, thank you. Thank you so much, David, for that introduction. And also thank you to Development Initiatives for having me here today. So as David mentioned, I lead the humanitarian program at NYU's Center on International Cooperation. And one of my main focuses over the past year has been to undertake a study on the so-called new way of working between humanitarian development and peace-building actors. And this study is focused mainly on efforts to bridge the humanitarian development divide at the country level. So we've heard quite a bit, I think, already about some of the more global level processes, and I'm going to hope to talk mainly about what's going on in countries. And so for this study, for instance, it involved fieldwork in Chad, Somalia, and Nigeria, but it's also including a broad canvas of other countries. I'm quite eager to get to the Q&A, so I will try to keep my remarks brief. I'd like to focus first on some of the findings, and in particular, some of the more promising trends that appear to be occurring, and then I'll get to the challenges, and then time permitting, I've been asked also to pose some questions to the group. So one of the crucial findings is that governments in a number of countries are taking increasing ownership over emergency response and recovery efforts. And this is true in middle income countries like Indonesia, but it's also true in places like Somalia, where the government has created new emergency management institutions. It's adopted inclusive recovery policies. It's built an entirely new aid coordination structure, which spans the triple nexus in some interesting ways. And it's included humanitarian needs in its national development plan, which is also a trend in a number of other countries. Similarly, for instance, in Chad, the government has recently nationalized all refugee schools and turned them into public schools. Related to this, and I think we did hear a little bit of this in some of the other presentations, is that there's an increased recognition on the part of international actors of the need to support rather than supplant national and local coordination and service delivery capacities. So we heard earlier, I think from DFID, about their efforts to strengthen health systems in DRC, Ethiopia, and Somalia, and also, of course, the World Bank's efforts in DRC, Yemen, and other places. So those of us who come from the humanitarian side of things would recognize that these two changes alone represent a pretty substantial step change away from a system that is traditionally operated by creating parallel structures. And those parallel structures, so thinking about camps, medical centers that are only for refugees and these kinds of things, they tend over time to actually undermine indigenous solutions and indigenous capacities. So efforts to link up humanitarian services with national public systems is a pretty important trend that hopefully would in fact increase the capacity of those systems. It's also notable that this shift, perhaps more than any others, and I've noted a few others on the slide, but that it's not only opening up space for, but it's actually being fueled by the increasing involvement of development finance and development actors in crises contexts. And again, I'm happy to go through in the Q&A in more detail of any of these findings. Now, moving on to challenges and constraints, there are enormous challenges that are remaining. So the opening presentation emphasized the lack of development financing that's channeled through public systems. This is a really enormous problem. And then also it noted the fall in overall ODA in crisis context. So development aid goes down when a crisis hits, and then humanitarian aid increases, but not enough to make up that difference. There's also more and more recognition that, in fact, countries need both at the same time rather than sort of switching in between the two. Another crucial challenge is the lack of quick dispersing and adaptable development finance. So the World Bank and others have created a lot of new, very interesting and innovative instruments specifically suited for crisis contexts. But the majority of development finance still seems to be quite slow moving and rigid. And some of the sort of flagship programs that are going on in a lot of countries today, you know, a lot of them took over a year to actually get up and running. Now, this slide also notes a number of other challenges, but I'll highlight two for now, which I think are particularly important. One is that development interventions in crisis contexts are not always informed by humanitarian or peace building concerns. So sometimes they're simply programs that perhaps would make sense in a non-crisis context that are simply transplanted to a crisis context, or the planning of them happens at headquarters, and peace building and humanitarian actors who may have a long-standing presence in the country are not involved. And so this is a concern, and it also raises concerns for humanitarians about humanitarian principles and other commitments. And then the second one is that there's a lack of coherence sometimes between programs and reforms that are aimed at fiscal discipline or fiscal consolidation, and those aimed at strengthening public systems and services. So in some ways, the international system often is pulling crisis-affected countries in two different directions. One, saying, prioritize debt and deficit reduction, which often requires sometimes pretty drastic cuts in social spending. And then at the same time, the system is also saying, no, but strengthen your social systems and social services, for instance, to absorb refugees and IDPs. And this, I think, is a problem that has received less attention than some of the other ones, but is really fundamentally important. All right, so moving on. So in addition to these sort of trends and challenges, in most of the countries that I've looked into, there are some key gaps that greater development engagement could help to fill. And one of these is the lack of systems and procedures in place in a lot of countries for responding to protracted crises, which requires, governments themselves have their own nexus issue because they often have their emergency management structures, and then they have their normal line ministries and development structures, but there's a gap within governments as well as within the international system. And so to sort of help address this gap, there's 4 areas where I think governments need particular support. The first is help developing budgeting and procurement rules that are flexible enough to address this particular issue. Another one is support within national planning processes of including affected populations and their particular needs into development plans and sector strategies. And this is happening, but it's not happening. It's not happening everywhere. A third one is how to create incentives and systems for deploying and retaining civil servants in crisis areas, including recovery areas. So oftentimes, the entire civil administration will flee a crisis area, and governments often lack incentives and policies around how to actually bring civil servants, teachers, doctors, back to areas once it's safe to do so. And then finally, updating rules regarding fiscal transfers from central governments to local governments in affected areas. This is a huge problem, especially in places that have absorbed a lot of displaced people. There are cities that are tripled, quadrupled their normal size. But they receive funding from the central government based on their pre-crisis resident population numbers. And so they're basically receiving the same amount of money despite having 4 times the amount of people. And this creates political problems as much as it creates financial problems related to the underfunding of services. I don't want to take up too much more time, so I'll sort of skip the other ones, but there are a number of other gaps that I think development actors could help fill that we can perhaps get into later. And then finally, I was asked just to pose a few questions, and I think people are also posing them in the chat box. So I'll just maybe pick out 1 or 2. So one is, I think this last one is sort of how do we think about what success should look like in a protracted crisis context? And of course, it should look different depending on the situation. But how quickly are we asking? Should we be expecting this shift towards a more development-oriented approach to take shape, and what kind of shape should it take? And then another one I think that's important is how can development donors and actors best use their own leverage resources and expertise to help address exogenous drivers of vulnerability and impoverishment? So the ones that are compounding these problems, but that are not within the country itself's control, or actors within the country itself to do much about. And so there I'm thinking of things like illicit tax flows, currency and commodity shocks, these kinds of things that sort of start from the outside, but that really compound the problems that are going on within these countries. So I think I will stop there, and thank you very much.
Leah, very, very helpful. And as you say, there are a lot of points you brought up there, which we can come back to in the discussion, and we look forward to that in a couple of minutes. Let's see whether we can now rejoin Metsi in Burkina Faso. Metsi, visually we had you for a second. Can you hear us?
Yes, I can hear you.
Let's see if it works now, Metsi, and apologies for the inconvenience for you, but we're hoping very much we can hear from you.
Yeah, let's see whether I can just go the next 3-4 minutes without interruption. I had, just next slide, please. I wanted to provide a context of where Burkina Faso is today and highlighting growing insecurities, vulnerabilities, and risks. Also, the issues that are related to cross-border challenges between Mali, Niger, and recently including Togo, Ghana, and Benin. Next, please. And in this context, in 2016, it's important to know that the timing, when I came into Burkina Faso as an RC, government has also, it was a new government that came from the transition. So there were converging aspects that allowed for a new way of engaging in Burkina Faso. And we thought it would be important for us from a UN perspective to first make sure that their national plan is SDG aligned. Second, to work in a manner that in our analytics, we are focusing on how to target those that are left behind. Third, given Burkina Faso had just come out of a successful political transition, there was a commitment to ensure that we are sustaining the gains from the transition, and we are also helping the country to sustain the conditions for a sustainable peace. And the last part was working in a manner that Burkina Faso over time, over a period, works towards ending humanitarian needs, plus addressing what would be natural hazards. Next slide, please. So in this context, what I also wanted to highlight operationally is that had we only used a traditional way of engaging on planning, we would not have been able to put a focus on the Sahel band of Burkina Faso. Because of the guiding frameworks that we had, it became very clear that the Sahel band of Burkina Faso was a concentration of risks, vulnerabilities, and inequalities. As a result, it was evident that the manner in which we needed to engage, we had to embark on a process that brought everybody to the table. We had to reach consensus around how to work differently. And within that, it would also mean how would the financing flow towards what we would have all appreciated as the key concerns for Burkina Faso. You can see what's on the slide. Next, please. This slide, I put it because even as we were engaging to get everybody around the table, we still had a situation saying, but development partners are very slow. Development partners complaining about the humanitarian actors, and those that are involved in social cohesion were doing their thing and nobody was talking together. And yet it was clear we are in the same context, we are in the same country, and we are in the same boat. It was not enough just to sit back and say the whole was not on any of our sides because we're all in the same boat and it is the country that would be sinking. Next slide, please. So having acknowledged that we are on the same boat, and I know David, you made allusion to this at the beginning, and for Burkina Faso, this is what brought us to creating conditions to start talking about how we are channeling financing in a manner that addresses coherence and in a manner that allows us to target those that are furthest behind, and in a manner that brings together humanitarian, development, and peace actors together. The additional joint analysis using the range of the tools that looked into where are those that are most vulnerable and that over the years have been benefiting from using humanitarian finance. So we use the HNO. We also use the risk inform, and that allows the development partners and the peace actors to see that there are areas where we should have been working together, but only the humanitarian actors were there. We also, you see the range of tools that I have outlined here that I will not go into, but it's just important to know that having used that and with everybody at the table, it allows us to have a shared appreciation of the risks, of vulnerabilities, and of what we needed to be doing together. From a joint planning perspective, we were able to agree on 5 collective outcomes that brought the 3 actors together, the humanitarian, development, and peace actors together. Thematically, there would have been a focus on nutrition, on food security, on peace building and social cohesion. But of course, the overall intention and the outcome would also be to ensure that we are reducing poverty incidents. Next slide, please. So the collective outcome, the 5 collective outcomes are quite ambitious, but this is what is needed. We are still at a point where we have not been able to mobilize all the financing, but I just want to go specifically into the nutrition collective outcome, because this is where we're seeing indications of very positive, even though timid, behavioral change from a financing perspective. And what is notable is, one, for the very first time in the history of Burkina Faso, government itself is putting something, and they have introduced a new budget line to address nutrition outcomes since 2018. This is a first, and this comes out of an agreement on collective outcomes. Second is that from a World Bank perspective, focusing on human capital, nutrition is one of the outcomes that they are contributing to as well. Between ECHO an alignment around ensuring that we are helping the country action on nutrition rates, chronic malnutrition for children under 5, and some of the bilaterals are also seeing how best they can provide support around this. So I just wanted to use this as an example of it is possible. It's still very timid. It is not as systematic yet, but there's a good beginning, and we are hoping that we should be able to apply the same commitment using collective outcomes to bring the financing in a very flexible manner to some of the areas that require us to take an overall, all of partners, all of society, and across the SDGs that are critical for Burkina Faso. Next, please. So here, here's a slide that just shows since 2016, the evolution with the figures. Where you have ECHO, it's a mistake. I should have put DEVCO as well. And I think one thing that I also want to highlight is that I'm always reminded of what the Secretary General told us, that people do not experience problems in silos. What has enabled us to start talking together, and me as the RC, making sure that we are supporting the country in a manner that allows that we are focusing on those feathers behind. We are making sure that we're ending humanitarian needs. It took a lot of heavy lifting. It took a lot of engaging and convincing everybody, because most of the capitals have not as yet aligned with how to go towards collective outcomes. And I think it was said earlier, because development finance has its own prerogatives, humanitarian finance also has its own prerogatives. We are hoping with the OECD DAC recommendation that there will be some flexibility, and that would hopefully catalyze, and over a period of 5 to 7 years, we can see progressively how we can start reducing vulnerabilities, and we can all go towards collective outcomes. And finally, we agreed on the metrics, because we know we're all supporting collective outcomes. We have a way of measuring annually what is the progress towards what we agreed to. And based on that, we are hoping that in terms of financing, this will be an incentive to assure those that are concerned about targeting, those that are concerned about impact, to see that we really have agreed on metrics that we can track together and that are aligned with government plans that bring everybody around the table. I will stop here for now.
Thank you very much, Mitzi, for your presentation and for your patience in putting up with the communications difficulties. We benefit greatly from your views. And thank you to all our panelists for the valuable and important insights that we have been given. We now have about 20 minutes, roughly speaking, for a Q&A session. And if I may, what I will do is channel to the four panelists a number of questions which have come to us. And I'll begin with a question which I think Matthew might be able to come in on. Matthew, it's a question from Dan Coppard at Development Initiatives, which essentially asks you for your thoughts on the disconnect between the requirements for long-term engagement and the type of impacts which are harder to quantify. Sorry, I'm just summarizing a very somewhat complex question. Is there a need to make the case for the right types of interventions in fragile contexts? Who specifically needs support in making this case, and how? Matthew, can you tackle that one?
Yep, I'm very happy to have a crack at that. So let me just check out if I've understood the question. It's the need to quantify. You're talking about how to quantify the impact in fragile states.
That's right. Yes.
I wasn't quite sure how that linked with the long-term engagement, but I mean, but perhaps what I would say on that is that I think there is a real challenge here with engagement, because of course when you have a country which is perhaps maybe fragile but not in crisis, as it tips into crisis, a lot of the political incentives all round it change. And therefore you may well get disconnects in the way that other countries, including donors, are treating a country. So I think for me, one of the most important things here is that we recognize that when we're looking at success in this area, and that one of the other questioners was talking about, how do we measure success? I think one of the points about success is that even in conflict, even in crises, we need to be doing everything we can to keep people safe and enable them to live decently and in dignity. And that means, I think it was Oluseji who said that, the World Bank is looking at how it can re-engage very quickly after a crisis. But I think the challenge for all of us is, how do we continue with development engagement during a crisis so that we can keep that going? So that we're not just looking at, well, what can we do with humanitarian instruments? We're looking at what can we do with all the instruments at our disposal to enable us to kind of meet those goals. And I think the other thing I would say about that is that, and it's also a bit in answer to something that Leah said about the importance of national ownership and supporting national services. Absolutely important wherever that's possible, but we also have to recognize that also in some crises, governments may either lack the capacity to be able to deliver, so we'll need to look at ways to shore that up, but they also may lack commitment to reach certain peoples, because where there's a conflict, the government is very often a party to a conflict. So we need to kind of make sure that we're really understanding the conflict dynamics as we look at how to work with governments and other institutions. So I'm not quite sure I've answered the specific question, but have another go at me if you feel I haven't.
No, that's just fine, Matthew. Many, many thanks for that. And now a question to Oluseji, which comes from Debbie Hillier at Oxfam. Debbie asks Oluseji how the bank gets involved in developing sort of nexus-based collective outcomes in relation to country strategies. Would you like to take that one first?
Good question.
Yes, hello. I was there, but I believe you can. I hope you can hear me now.
Yes, perfectly.
Thank you for the question, Debbie. So the question is how the World Bank gets involved in the nexus?
In relation to country strategies. So in other words, in developing collective outcomes based on the nexus, but in the context of individual country strategies.
Okay. All right, thanks. The typical, if you allow the use of the word, the typical mode of engagement for the bank starts with a systematic country diagnostic, which then informs a country partnership framework between each country and the bank, and that's on a sequential. However, let me take that first. So when there is a situation in which the country is relatively stable, that's the sequence that one goes through. So I'm not going to dwell on that, because I think the more interesting thing for the purpose of this conversation is when the situation is not normal, when you have a pre-crisis situation or intra-crisis situation. That is where, in particular, customization becomes even more important. Okay, so I'll use a couple of examples, which I hope would. So if you take a situation such as Yemen, for example, I'm citing Yemen just because it's one of those to which I've already read. We find that despite World Bank engagement with the country, the practical situation on the ground is just such that the normal or typical mode of engagement and implementation support was not available to the World Bank group because of the active conflict going on there. But fortunately, of course, we do have partners in UNICEF who had ground presence working through the government, of course, government facilities, of course, and also WHO. So we actually deployed resources through UNICEF and WHO. More recently, in South Sudan, and the South Sudan example is actually just a few weeks old or so. Our engagement with South Sudan has been directly with government, and of course with the government contracting certain independent actors to deliver services in the states of Upper Nile and Jonglei. More recently, because of the situation on the ground, evolution of the situation on the ground in South Sudan, in the most recent grant that was approved to South Sudan, in fact, the bank is working not only with government, but it's also working through the ICRC and UNICEF for service delivery in those parts. So the point I'm trying to make is it's a matter of certain principles apply, which is country policy, country strategy front and center, with the bank as an informed partner in this. But when normal situations do not apply, then one has to customize to ensure that the country engagement doesn't suffer, and importantly, the services really reach those in need. One quick point I'd just like to make here is, if you're trying to work on a very small scale, then maybe that is not a hindrance. But if you're trying to work on a very large scale, i.e. across a whole country or across a significant chunk of a country, then the necessity, or maybe it's not even necessity, the centrality of effective country engagement and scale can sometimes slow things down. And I know one of our previous speakers had talked about how sometimes things just seem to be slow. So over.
Okay. Thanks very much, Ozoji. I mean, there's a lot that one could discuss further in relation to the role of the bank at the interface between development and crisis response, and indeed one interesting thing would be the potential for scale up of existing mechanisms such as the famine action mechanism or the global concessional financing mechanism. I think also the need for kind of complementarity between the World Bank and UN approaches it would also be very important. But look, I would like to move on to a question or two to Leah. There is, Leah, one question that came in from Marie Wagner is, I mean, we have on the one hand the call for early action in crisis situations, or more anticipatory and less reactive responses when it comes to humanitarian financing. But how can we align that better with the basic pressures to link humanitarian and development financing more closely together? You've got sort of early action on the one hand, but then there's a kind of a more long-term or medium-term debate about linking humanitarian and development financing more closely together. Would you like to try your hand at that?
Sure. Yeah, no, it's a great question. And it's an important question. In some sense, I think the two conversations have actually been a little bit happening in parallel. So there is a lot of emphasis now on the need for more anticipatory finance. You know, the UN has a whole prevention agenda now, and so acting early is a key priority there. And then also sort of the humanitarian development conversation has, I think, often been happening within the protracted crisis, so already kind of well into a crisis situation, and it can often focus on things like durable solutions. So they are different, but they're entirely linked, in part because almost every single protracted crisis also has a series of shocks that compound that crisis, that go on, whether it's a major flood or drought or new conflict or an economic shock. And so the early action is needed within a protracted crisis, just like it's needed within a sudden onset situation that may not have been a crisis before. So they are very linked. And I would say, you know, there are interesting things happening. You mentioned FAM and some other sort of more anticipatory mechanisms that are being developed. The challenge here is that there's very little ODA that actually goes towards prevention. I think and have very great mechanisms, but it will be hard for them to actually make a difference on the ground unless they're funded. There is also there's a growing amount of evidence for why they should be funded. I mean, the sort of the business case for early action and anticipatory finance is about as rock solid as it gets, and a lot of studies find that $1 invested early saves $10 to $100 in later responses, and that's just on the finance side, let alone on the sort of human gains from an earlier response. But so just to say that they are very much a linked conversation, I think, even if they're often happening in parallel. But there's still a lot of challenges when it comes to shifting financing. And then lastly, I'll just say, because it was also mentioned and it's key, is that one way to get at this problem is to actually have development financing not be withdrawn when a crisis hits. So one of the earliest ways to react to something is to have the programs that are already in place and the funding streams that are already in place simply adapt, rather than leave and then have humanitarians come in, which can, of course, slow things down enormously.
Thank you very much, Leah. And I'd like to put a question to Metzi, if you're still there, Metzi, if you can hear us. Hello.
I'm still here. Can you hear me?
Just a couple of questions, Betsy. First, Leah had mentioned in her earlier presentation, the basic question of what success should look like when we're talking about, in effect, trying to strengthen the nexus between humanitarian development in a protracted country situation. How would you define success, Metzi?
That's a big question. I would look at three things. I think the very first thing is in a context where we want to bring coherence and we work towards collective outcomes, governments have to definitely be fully engaged. Because traditionally, when you look at how we have engaged on the humanitarian side, governments have very rarely been as active. So that's the first thing, governments being fully engaged. And the second part is us making sure that we are operationalizing an all of society approach from an SDG perspective and ending needs. What do I mean by this? The commitment to localize, to make sure that local stakeholders and local NGOs have the capacity to support government responses, I think should be one of the indicators to show success. After all, local NGOs are part of a country's capacity, and I think that would also be one of the ways, while we know, of course, that governments themselves need to be supported. The third is from all of us as the partners in development and actors, and I want to refer to collective outcomes again, knowing very well that the impact can only be seen over a period, but within that period, there are things, depending on how the collective outcomes are crafted, that can be tracked, that progress can be appreciated over a period. Success should look like the partners being able to agree on a set of collective outcomes and putting resources towards those collective outcomes. Operationally, most of the things that need to be done are local. They are not at a central level. So we should also be able to say where in Burkina Faso or in the Sahel region of Burkina Faso will I see how this financing is making a difference from a nexus perspective, and how our impact, as we would want to appreciate over a period, can be tracked with the people on the ground and working with local stakeholders as part of a country's capacities. So I would, say it will be a package, looking at who the partners are in country, the capacities that are required, a government's own commitment. It's not from a resource perspective, but from a political willingness perspective, and us being able to commit to shifting the tide and going towards the collective outcomes with the necessary financing that would be required. Over.
Thanks very much, Betty. In fact, there's one further question from Howard Mullett, which in a way picks up on what you were just saying about the need for, or the role of governments. What about the difficulty that in many fragile or conflict-affected situations, states are squeezing space for civil society, and so I mean, there are risks attached here if too much emphasis is placed on the role of the state. I mean, do you know of any practices which exist to enable us to mitigate the risk that civil society would be excluded altogether by governments in this area?
I have to say, in the case of Burkina Faso, the experience that we have, and this is because from a planning perspective, government acknowledges that NGOs and civil society has to be at the table. So this is not our experience, but I do know that elsewhere this is not the case. Second, and there are trends, though, that many of the civil society organizations are working together to support one another on how to engage with states. It could be that traditionally there was mistrust, given how things have been in the past, but recently engagement with civil society is around how do we make sure that we are putting what matters to the table. Respect for rule of law, ensuring that no one is left behind, and civil society being able to demonstrate that it is part of the results chain. So this, fortunately, is what this has been our experience. And we are also looking at how countries like Burkina Faso, as a government, can encourage when they come together through their ECOWAS or other regional fora can talk about the importance of taking an all-of-society approach, engaging with civil society, because we know that once there's a conflict between civil society and government, it's always...
Yes, thank you very much, Betsy. And a final question to Matthew. Matthew, I mean, Leah brought it up at the end of her presentation. How do you think development donors and actors can best use their leverage and their resources in order to help address the exogenous drivers of vulnerability? I think that's quite an important question.
Absolutely. I think that's a really important question. And I think I'm really glad that Leah raised it, because we often tend to kind of concentrate these things, assuming that everything stops at the borders of a country. And, you know, some of us have a country office sort of approach, which maybe reinforces that. So I think it's a really important point. I mean, I think it's very context specific, even so. I mean, I think, you know, one thing that was mentioned were sort of illicit financial flows and you know, financial crimes and so on, but there's also there are also exogenous factors which relate to terrorism, which relate to military dimensions as well, and they all affect different regions and different countries in different ways. So I think that the answer to that is, first of all, making sure, coming back to the point I made earlier, that we really understand our analysis. We really understand what is driving conflict, what is driving crises. And then when we identify exogenous factors for that, we need to be able to work. Generally, they won't be able to be solved by any one actor, but we need to work collectively to do those. So I think that kind of instruction to us all to think regionally, I think, is a very important one. Within DFID, for example, we're looking at beefing up what we're doing on trying to help tackle illicit financial flows. And that means working not just even in the regions necessarily that are affected by crisis, but it means we're working in financial centers, what's happening in London, in the financial centers, what's happening in Dubai or in Singapore, and making sure that we're cutting off any kind of causes at source. So it's not just regionally, it's also globally. And I think we do need to work together very carefully on that. And we need to go beyond development and humanitarian actors to involve political and sometimes even military actors, which can be quite uncomfortable for some of us. I'll stop there. Over.
Thank you very much, Matthew. So that brings us, in fact, ladies and gentlemen, to the end of the webinar. And I won't try in any way to sort of summarize what has been a very rich and wide-ranging discussion, but I just pick out one or two points which struck me as we were hearing the various presentations and the comments afterwards. And in case I forget to say it at the end, I'd just like to say that unanswered questions will be responded to on Development Initiative's own website by the panelists where possible, and Development Initiatives will itself post a video of the webinar on its website in the next couple of days, and we'll follow up on the relevant context. And we obviously want to keep you updated on the forthcoming webinars in this series. So, I mean, I must say I found the discussion fascinating, and I mean, I think among the points I would pick out are that there is a real effort being made by the donors whom we heard from and at country level to achieve coherence between the instruments, but between the forms of financing, the forms of intervention. But on the other hand, it's not going to happen easily. It won't happen overnight, and there are many challenges still associated with it. I thought that, roughly speaking, in chronological order, I thought that Matthew's emphasis on the need to ensure sufficient funding for prevention and resilience, I thought that that came across very clearly, and it is encouraging to hear that DFID attached priority to that it's an area which is underfunded at present. I think there was general recognition of the need for innovative financing mechanisms which will help us to respond to the particular challenges here. Again, the need for win-wins which will ensure peace and that peace and resilience are properly served. I thought that came across very clearly. Olusoji's comments, I was personally encouraged by the various things he said. The fact that the World Bank is not purely interested in the financing instruments per se, but in the learnings which will come from involvement with the Nexus in the adaptation of its own policies and priorities, and the gender dimension, the importance of partnerships with other agencies, co-convenings. I mean, all of that spoke to me about a willingness on the part of the World Bank to try to give concrete form to coherence. And I thought that was encouraging. Lee, among many interesting points she made, was the one about the importance of supporting national systems rather than supplanting them. I think myself this is absolutely vital, and it's one that sometimes gets lost sight of, that we have to, as far as possible, work with existing systems and strengthen them. We have to avoid, therefore, parallel structures creeping in. I mean, there is this fundamental sort of tension between development aid decreasing, as Lee was pointing out, and humanitarian aid going up, but with a gap left in the middle, and that is quite worrying. I hear that in various fora at the moment. I mean, sometimes it can be represented as a threat, you know, to certain people who are attached to development outcomes will worry that let's say the overall resources for implementation of the SDGs will suffer if there is if the humanitarian needs are too great. But on the other hand, others are more realistic and accept that with the level of conflict in the world, we have to simply recognize the reality that humanitarian needs are going up, and even if that means that there is ultimately a larger share of the available cake being devoted to humanitarian needs, well then so be it. But you know, there is a sort of undoubtedly a tension there. And then Lee was also making points about the slowness and rigidity of much development finance, and her point about fiscal consolidation, I think, was also well taken. That there has to be coherence between the funding which might be aimed at fiscal consolidation and resources which go towards strengthening social protection and so on. So I won't, I mean, there were many other points. Metzi's emphasis, I thought there were many things which struck a chord with me, in particular, the actually very reassuring account she gave of what's happening in Burkina Faso about the national plans there being aligned with the SDGs, the clear political priority being given to targeting those left behind. And I have to say that I liked very much her slide about everybody being in the same boat. I think that often a picture can be better than 1,000 words. I thought that one struck a very clear chord with all of us. What Metzi had to say about collective outcomes being the collective outcomes being aimed at in Burkina Faso, I thought was also very interesting. So I hope that I have done some justice to the distinguished panelists and their contributions. I would have loved for this webinar to continue for several hours more, and I thank everybody who contributed questions and comments, and sorry if I misinterpreted them here and there in the rush, but I think we had a very good discussion within the hour and a half available. I'd like to thank Development Initiatives for putting this event together, and I'm delighted to have had been able to play a small part in it. Thanks to everyone, and we will follow up in the way indicated earlier on. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Is that okay?